What does the rest of the galaxy think about the Imperium of man? The empire of a million worlds has stood firm against the forces of disorder and destruction for 10,000 years. Of course, doing something like that is going to make you a lot of enemies. People don't like seeing their fellows killed by genetically engineered super soldiers and advanced armour. Neither, it turns out, do intergalactic hive minds. On the other hand, there are actually some out there that do in fact like that sort of thing. In this video, I want to outline what different factions outside of the Imperium of Man think about it. I've used as many examples from the lore and the real world as I can. The factions that I'm going to focus on today are the Tyranids, Orks, Eldar, Necrons and Tau. I'm also using a framework that real-world policymakers use when trying to define national perceptions abroad. It's called the National Branding Framework, and it focuses on 6 main areas: governance, culture and heritage, people, exports, investment and immigration, and tourism. Yes, there actually is tourism in the Imperium of Man. I have timestamps to all of these sections in the description below if you want to skip ahead. So, let's dive in and start things off with the framework that I'm going to be using. There are lots of ways to find out what different groups outside of the Imperium really think about it. Today, I want to use the National Branding Framework developed by Simon Anholt. Simon is a British policy advisor and he has consulted various different heads of state, CEOs and the like. His framework focuses on 6 different areas to be considered when assessing and managing a nation's brand image abroad. So let's go through them one by one. First up is governance. This usually refers to the competency and fairness of a government. These are things where the Imperium often falls flat or just collapses in itself like a dying star. I've already spoken about how bad the Imperium is in my series How to Save the Imperium and Why It Won't Work. There should be a link to the first video in that series somewhere on the screen or in the description below. Basically, the Imperium is an authoritarian, totalitarian, fascistic nightmare of a place. There is no transparency when it comes to government decisions on policy making. People have little to no autonomy in making decisions on how to run their institutions. This is the same throughout the whole Imperium. There are virtually no means to impact government decisions for the vast majority of the people in the galaxy. But even those at the very top, like the High Lords of Terror themselves, will often just have to go along with certain things that are described as the Emperor's will. The Imperium is stable enough though. It is functionally a single state that has existed 10 millennia virtually unchanged. Its various organizations and bodies rarely ever change, and when they do, it's usually considered to be a huge deal in the lore. There are so few examples of nations in the real world that have existed for thousands of years, let alone nations that change very little for that whole time. China and ancient Egypt are 2 examples that do spring to mind, but in reality these places are usually the exception to the rule. Imperial culture is up next, and their culture and heritage is actually really strong throughout the whole setting. No matter where you are in the galaxy, or what crazy conditions exist locally, most Imperial culture will be the same, or at least highly recognizable. The Emperor calls himself the Emperor of mankind, and so do the vast majority of people who live in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium's Milky Way galaxy. The Great Crusade to conquer the galaxy unified virtually every human community under the same government thousands of years before the current date in the timeline. This means that the same styles of artwork and social structures will exist no matter where you go. A sparsely populated agri-world will have the same imperial aquila as a densely populated hive world on the other side of the galaxy. There are a couple of historical parallels to this that come to my mind. Firstly are the styles of buildings that were built by European empires in the 1700s and 1800s. Much of the buildings that they built tried to emulate classical styles that were common in ancient Greece and Rome. Napoleon built the Arc de Triomphe in Paris in the same style as the ancient Roman triumphal arches that were built to commemorate important conquests. This gave the French emperor some architectural gravitas, and it made it seem, at least to some, that he was a sort of heir to this older and more established empire. You can see something similar in the modern world when it comes to corporate branding as well. There are precious few places on Earth where you won't be able to find the golden arches of McDonald's or the red and white of a Coke. International global capitalist companies market themselves around the world in much the same way as the Imperium does around the galaxy. They use relatively simple logos and brands that will be recognized by pretty much everyone, regardless of cultural background, language, or level of education. Now, am I saying that the United States has conquered the world and forced its imagery, culture, and companies on the rest of the planet? Yeah, pretty much. Sometimes the countries were willing, sometimes not. I would say that most countries around the world probably look more similar to the US today than what they looked like a couple of generations ago. But I would put that down more to corporate conquest than anything as extreme as the Great Crusade. You can say this is good or bad yourself, it's probably both, to be honest with you. And to be clear, I'm not talking about immigration or the displacement of any groups of people. The US has basically made the rest of the world want to buy into its culture. They aren't the only group to do this, of course. Other countries do the same. Sure, the US isn't even the first one to do this. There's no archaeological evidence that the Celts ever invaded or migrated in large numbers to Britain or Ireland. Yet their artwork, culture, and languages made their way to these places through trade with mainland Europe. The Imperium does something similar to the modern-day US when it comes to culture and heritage. Worlds can join this larger economic and cultural system willingly. If not, there are other options. When it comes to people, the galaxy is a big place. There are, of course, 1 million worlds in the Imperium. Now, while some of them might only have a tiny population, many others will have populations several times that of present-day Earth. There's more diversity in terms of ethnic makeup and local customs in the Imperium than it's possible to convey, but there is, however, one thing that unites all of these hundreds of thousands of planets: their unwavering belief in the Emperor as the leader of humanity. The cultural homogenization that exists in the Imperium means that they are incredibly regressive, superstitious, and backward in so many different ways. Things like xenophobia and bigotry toward anyone or anything that might possibly be different aren't just encouraged, they're outright enforced by the government. Imperial citizens are generally ignorant of the wider universe beyond their immediate needs. This is a pretty universal theme throughout all 40k media. As a society, they worship the Emperor on the Golden Throne of Terra. There is almost no social mobility, and anyone who suggests that anything could possibly be otherwise is punished. I talk about Imperial society in more detail in the second video on my How to Save the Imperium series, if you want to give it a look. Now on to tourism. The national branding framework is often used by real-world tourism boards in different countries. You might not think that there's any tourism in the Imperium at all, but you'd be wrong. There is both internal tourism, where its citizens will travel around, and external tourism, where people from outside visit. The internal tourism is pretty obvious. There are pleasure worlds which are considered to be paradises. These are often used by high-ranking Imperial officers or Inquisitors as retirement destinations, or for relaxation when they're not carrying out their vital and dangerous duties. For most Imperial citizens to justify travelling around, however, they will likely need to be on pilgrimage. For a long time, this was the most common way for people around the world to experience life beyond their own hometown or area. They would walk to a famous religious site like Jerusalem, Mecca, or Santiago de Compostela. In fact, many people still do these journeys today. In the Imperium, undertaking something like this will likely take the rest of your life. People will travel however they can to a shrine world or a place of worship to a specific Imperial saint or event. The most important pilgrimage route, of course, though, is to Holy Terra itself, where people will try to view the eternity gates of the Imperial Palace. In the novel The Carrying the Throne by Chris Wright, we actually get to see the final point of this pilgrimage, when the gates open on Sanguinalia, the main religious festival in the Imperium. It celebrates the sacrifice of the Primarch Sanguinius and the ascension of the Emperor to the Golden Throne at the end of the Horus Heresy. I highly recommend that book. It goes into great detail to describe the numbers of people involved in the pilgrimage and how big of a deal it was for the few who actually got to witness the opening of the gates. When it comes to external tourism, there are actually a few reasons why some of the non-Imperial groups that exist in the setting would want to visit. None of these reasons, though, are any good for Imperial subjects, but I'll mention them as we go through the factions a little later on. The next factor to consider here is goods and exports, and the perception of Imperial goods and products. While there is a huge amount of internal trade that goes on between the various worlds and holdings of the Imperium, there is precious little that is exported from Imperial-held space. Imperial-produced goods have a really bad reputation. There are references made by certain Xenos characters that other empires, like the Tau, have all the good stuff, and that they would never use Imperial weapons or objects if they had any other options. Of course, there's exceptions to this. One of the non-Imperial groups that uses the most Imperial products that I've come across, other than the Orks of course, is actually the Dark Eldar. When he was preparing to take control of the Dark City of Comera, the then up-and-coming Archon Azdrabel Vect raided Imperial shipping routes to attract the attention of the Salamanders chapter of Space Marines. When all was said and done, and the Imperial raid in the Dark City had rescued the Salamander battle barge, The amount of Imperial goods that Vecht had looted was considered good enough to have been a boon to his cause and genuinely improved his material wealth. The Drukhari have also tried to gain access to some of the secrets of the Golden Throne. I won't spoil too much, but the Vaults of Terra novel series, which starts with the Carian Throne, is great and goes into a lot more detail on this. So, while the majority of goods produced by the Imperium are considered to be of pretty low quality, they do have access to some genuinely good stuff that is desired by other polities in the galaxy. The Imperium doesn't only just export war and suffering, occasionally a few useful things slip out into the wider galaxy too. The final factor of this framework is immigration and investment. Whoo, nice and controversial stuff to talk about. Now, most governments around the world will try to get foreign businesses or organizations to invest outside money in their country. It's also generally a good thing when people from somewhere else want to live in your country. Even people who complain about immigrants and refugees will often think that their nation is so good that everyone wants to come over and live there, and this terrible immigration is a threat to their way of life. Before I bring things back to the Imperium, I want to quickly talk about how we've seen some of these ideas play out here in Ireland, just as an example in the real world. I know I talk about Ireland a lot on this channel, but it's just because I personally know more about it than anywhere else. The last 30 or so years has seen us benefit hugely from both international investment and immigration. The food alone is just so much better now than it was when I was a child. Oh my god. The Celtic Tiger, that period of economic boom, is long gone, but it's definitely left some positives. Our knowledge economy punches well above its weight. People from all over the world do still come here to make a life for themselves. The pharmaceutical sector is by far the biggest area of our economy today, but the tech and finance sectors also employ lots of people on good salaries here. Today, Ireland actually has a growing population, and we nearly have as many people as we did before the Great Famine in 1845. In my life, I personally saw this country go from one where more people were leaving to one where more people were coming in. The post-colonial empathy that our history has given us means that people from all over the world wanted to come here and contribute to our country and our economy. But in the last couple of years, this international image of Ireland has started to change. The last few governments have been totally unwilling to allow housing to be built at even half the level that's required by this growing population. We actually have some of the most expensive housing in Europe. I was born in the early 1990s, and I'm in the first generation since independence to have a lower quality of life than my parents. There is no easy fix for this. The housing crisis is super complicated, and it's going to take years to see any positive changes, even if the government actually starts trying to fix the problem tomorrow. But in this environment, people have started to turn to easy answers. Bigotry and anti-immigration sentiment have started to grow in Ireland for the first time in the last couple of years. Refugees fleeing war zones are getting blamed for locals not being able to afford homes. This has led to protests and some of the first rioting in Dublin in decades. Because it's so unusual, international media outlets have reported it, and now more and more people I meet from other countries have started to question whether or not Ireland really is a good place to visit, let alone invest in or contribute toward. Okay, now that I've gotten that rant over and probably upset people who struggle with things like basic critical thinking and regulating emotions, I think it's time to bring things back to the Imperium. While it might not be obvious at first, there is actually immigration to the Imperium of Man. Yes, there are of course the inevitable internal migrations of people and the resettlements of worlds that have been devastated by some calamity or other. But people also do move in from outside. There's a recurring theme in the lore of worlds that have been cut off from the wider galaxy for however long. These newly rediscovered worlds will absolutely have to be brought into the fold. This is conquest, yes, but it also brings people from outside of the Imperium in. These people will then definitely move through Imperial space and contribute in whatever way the Emperor sees fit. But many don't want to join this all-encompassing, authoritarian, fascistic, grim and dark nightmare of an empire. When it comes to things like aliens or mutants, however, that's a different story. Sure, there are exceptions. The occasional Inquisitor or Rogue Trader will employ the occasional Xenos agent, and there are some vitally important mutants like Navigators, but that's rare. This is the Imperium after all. They might not care what your skin color is when you're drafted to a Space Marine chapter or the Imperial Guard, but the Imperium really does hate aliens. So now that we've gone over the framework, let's talk about how at least some of the factions outside of the Imperium see it. Starting with the Tyranids here. This should be an easy one. They like the look of the Imperium. I'm sure they think it looks tasty. But I think we might need to expand on that one just a little. In general, they will descend upon worlds and use up whatever biomass they find to create more Tyranid organisms. These new organisms will then go on to repeat the process again on the next world, and so on. They're less like a military force and more like an unreasonable natural disaster, or like tourists from cruise ships. But not always. It does seem like there is an actual opinion that the Tyranids have of the Imperium of Man. In the novel The Devastation of Baal by Guy Haley, we actually get some sections from the perspective of the hive mind. From what we can read, the hive mind has an intelligence, though it's very different to what we would be familiar with ourselves as humans. The hive mind recognizes the blood angels represent a real threat to its continued harvesting of the worlds of mankind. So, it directs its forces there, to their homeworld, Baal. It's also implied that the hive mind has a sort of vendetta against the blood angels. They have clearly defeated it on enough occasions to leave some sort of a lasting impression. Each of the main Tyranid invasions of the galaxy has changed from the one before. They learn from their mistakes and defeats. In the first invasion, Behemoth, they focused their strength in one fleet and on one world at a time. This was then defeated at the Battle of Macragge. The subsequent invasions spread their forces out over a much wider front. Baal seems to have been a notable exception. The hive mind was clearly so frustrated by this one group within the Imperium that it went against its otherwise better judgment and disregarded the lessons it had previously learned, ultimately leading to another defeat. The Orks, on the other hand, generally seem to love the Imperium of Man. They think that the majority of the people they meet are weak and beneath them, yes, but there are notable exceptions, and they generally just love to come in and pay the Imperium a visit. I haven't read the War of the Beast series yet, so I can't really speak to any of the events that happen in that novel series, but there are plenty of instances in the rest of the lore of the Orks having contempt for most Yumis. They were written to be brutes who love a good scrap and think that fighting is the pinnacle of existence. This is, after all, a setting that was created by English nerds in the 1980s, so the Orks had their characterization based on English soccer hooligans. Yeah, I'm calling it soccer, by the way. GAA is, after all, the real football. The Orks are basically spacefaring versions of English soccer fans on a boozy weekend abroad. They're loud, messy, and only happy when fighting. If they think that someone is able to give them a good scrap, though, they will flock to them from all over the galaxy. And saying this, the Orks genuinely do have respect for those that can offer them a good fight. Since the Emperor is spoken about by so many humans in the setting, even the Orks have respect for him. Then there's individuals like the famous Commissar Yarrick. He helped lead the successful defense of the world of Armageddon against Ork invaders, and is now hugely popular with them as a result. While the Orks do think they're generally above the Yumis, they will often find themselves flocking to the Imperium, be it to loot war equipment, conquer worlds, or just to have a good elf fight. The Eldar, though, seem to have almost nothing but contempt for the Imperium and everything to do with it. Their word for human is Mon-Ki. They literally call us apes, which, while true, is definitely meant as an insult. In the short story The Armour of Fate, also by Guy Haley, we follow Rabute Gilliman as he struggles with his armour that is the story's namesake. It functioned as his life support, and as such he was unable to take it off for a very long time. This made life, of course, very difficult for him. There's a particularly great part in this short where Gilliman, he's struggling to read and interact with just anything other than war gear while using the armour. In the story, he meets Eldrad Ulfwan, one of the main leaders of the craft world Eldar, and arguably the main Eldar character in the setting. Rabute tries to speak with him in his native Eldar language, but Eldrad stops it immediately. Even though the functionally immortal demigod knows the language and is able to speak it perfectly, Eldrad can't stand hearing him speak it, but he does condescend Rabute a bit, and he says that he'll get it one day, or at least something to that effect. This is one of the less action-heavy 40k stories, but I love this moment as it gives us a great characterization of the Eldar, especially in how they relate to the people of the Imperium. They think so little of them that even one of the most capable minds in the galaxy, Imperial or not, is condescended and talked down to. It really reminds me of meeting tourists who do nothing but complain about where they're visiting, and keep saying that the way they do things at home is much better. Even the complaints about butchering their language is really reminiscent of certain stereotypes, deserved or not, of places like France, where it's more common for people to not accept non-native speakers trying the local language. There are, of course, other factions of the Eldar. The Exodites live in harmony with the nature of maiden worlds that are often seen as prime places for imperial settlement and colonization efforts. These Exodites will almost always try to expel the imperial invaders as much as possible. When I read about this, I think of all those protesters in places like Barcelona, where the locals are sick of tourists coming in and ruining the area for the people who live there. There are of course more extreme examples from history of this sort of thing too, but I like the more recent example better. Then when it comes to the Dark Eldar, they treat the Imperium pretty much like a resource to be exploited. I've already mentioned Vect, but he is the prime example of the kind of Drukhari leader that will raid the Imperium for plunder and slaves, because the Imperium, like everything else, is only really good for their own enrichment. So I'm just going to take a moment here as an aside and very quickly speak about the channel. I hope you're enjoying these videos, I hope you're getting something out of them. At the moment I'm still sub 1,000 subscribers, at least at the time of writing this script, and I'd really like to grow the channel by the end of the summer. I'd like to grow to a point where I can take things like content creation more seriously. So please do make sure to like the video and subscribe. Also, please leave a comment below. Of course it helps the algorithm, but I do my best to respond to as many of them as I possibly can. Hopefully, before the year is out, I'll be able to have the channel monetized and I can start commissioning artwork, thumbnails, and all that sort of thing. Back to the video. There's a popular meme of the Necrons seeing the Imperium as kids who can't get off their damn lawn. I love that idea myself, and I think it's pretty much accurate, but there's so much more that we could add to it. The Necrons have already long since colonized the galaxy, been turned into machines, and have only just started to reawaken from their 65 million year slumber recently in the lore. They awoke to a very different Milky Way galaxy. Often their tomb worlds have been colonized by other species. Plenty of Necron lords have come to the conclusion that the Imperium needs to simply be exterminated. They will use ancient technology far in advance of anything the Imperium can create to do this. Yet there are some that have at least a certain amount of respect for the Imperium of Man and its people. In the duology of novels by Nate Crowley, the twice-dead king, we follow the Necron lord Altix. He is disgusted by living material, and we can read about this disgust from his own perspective. In the novels, his dynasty of Ithacus comes under attack by an Imperial crusade, and we can see what reaction this gets from the perspective of the Necron leadership. Necron-tier society was cruel before the transition to their new metal bodies, and it remains so now in the present setting. Yet he is struck by just how cruel the Imperium can be to its own people. He sees human labourers forced to don spacesuits to go out into the void to repair a ship in the middle of a battle. He is also pretty much horrified when he goes aboard the ship and sees what life is like for the average Imperial citizen up close. Yet there was also a begrudging respect there too. When they first come to learn of the Crusade, the Necrons under his command fully acknowledge it for the vital, huge threat that it is. Other Necron leaders like the Silent King himself have also had at least some degree of respect for the Imperium. He mentions to the chapter master of the Blood Angels, Dante, that he spoke with his Primarch, Sanguinius. The fact that the leader of the Necrons took the time to contact both individuals is a big enough deal in and of itself. I also can't possibly talk about the Necrons and their relations with the Imperium without at least briefly mentioning Trazyn the Infinite. He is a collector who will bring back samples of pretty much everything in the galaxy to his home/museum of Solomons. He has taken particular interest in humanity, and he will go to great lengths to preserve people and artifacts from the Imperium of Man. He has even gone so far as to actively take a role in certain events in recent Imperial history, like the 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler. The Necrons, I think, have one of the more varied opinions of the Imperium. Some of them have a lower opinion of it than the Eldar, some of them only recognize it as a threat. But there is definitely an element of Necron society that respects the Imperium, not only for its military capabilities, but in and of itself. There are Necron individuals that genuinely appreciate Imperial history and culture and have gone out of their way to help its people. The Tau are in a way a mirror of the Necrons. They are the younger upstarts on the scene. To them, even the Imperium is an ancient menace from prehistory. They first started to explore their corner of the galaxy only a few thousand years before the current time in the setting. As such, they haven't really been able to develop the strength to fully go toe-to-toe with any of the more established powers. That being said, they are doing really well, better than many in the 40k fandom might like to admit. They have some of the best military equipment of any faction, and they are continuously improving upon it and developing it. Many in their leadership seem to view the Imperium as more of an obstacle than anything else. They will usually subvert local governments on the fringes of Imperial space and introduce newer, more advanced technologies. They will use things like trade and cultural exchange as a means of destabilizing fringe Imperial worlds and making them more easily conquered. While this certainly doesn't always work out for them, it does enough that they haven't stopped, and the Imperium still hasn't been able to stop them. At least for now, anyway. So what do the Tau think of the Imperium? The more they learn about it, the more scared of it they seem to get. And well, they should be. It's a massive empire that's existed for over 10,000 years. However, they still believe that it's their destiny to one day overcome this decaying and decrepit empire. Then, they will reign supreme over the galaxy for the greater good of all. When they do conquer human worlds, they still have some respect for the customs and traditions of the people in their new territory. Humans are usually still allowed to worship the Emperor in Tau space. Imperial technology, on the other hand, is considered kinda mixed by the Tau. Most of their own equipment and weapons are superior to what the Imperium can create, but there are still areas where they fall down. The big one is interstellar travel. The Tau just don't have the same access to the warp as others. There's a few reasons why that's the case, and maybe ultimately it's a good thing, but the scientists of the Tau's Earthcast generally do try to reverse engineer advanced Imperial equipment whenever they can. Generally though, they see themselves as at the very least ideologically superior to the Imperium. They see how poorly managed the Imperium is, and they see it as only a matter of time, maybe a long time, before it's subsumed into their empire. Whatever advantages the Imperium have will ultimately be utilized by the Tau, and Imperial society will just become another element of the Tau Empire. There are of course other groups outside of the Imperium that I could talk about, groups like Chaos, the Votan, and even just non-Imperial aligned worlds, but I think I should cover them in another video. Please let me know who you think I should cover in another video in the comments below. I hope that you've enjoyed this one. I'm sorry if I mispronounced any names, I really am trying to get better at that, and I know there's plenty of things that I missed out on too. If there is anything that you think I should have mentioned, if there's anything that I missed, or if there is just anything you'd like to contribute to the discussion, please leave a comment. I really do try to read and respond to as many of them as I can. And as always, if you did enjoy the channel, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Slán.